Because she does have such a very clear agenda in this work, well, perhaps multiple agendas, but she is without question seeking to articulate and promote a new consciousness. Anzaldúa gives us a great opportunity to consider some important questions about postmodernism as a literary and aesthetic movement. We've talked about how it continues many aspects of modernism, including fragmentation, and it actually expands or intensifies those. So we've already noted that one might consider postmodernism not strictly a radical break with what came before, but rather a shift, a difference in flavor. Harvey here describes a revolt against certain tendencies within modernism. Usually when people talk about that, they mean that modernists, not all of them, and not in every way, but they had a stronger tendency to want their art, their work, to stand outside of mass culture, right? And so they positioned themselves in a different realm from, say, Pulp Fiction. And you can think about Eudora Welty, if you want to consider that. Although she's a complicated example because, as we've seen, her characters in Petrified Man have a certain freak show quality of their own. But it's possible to see postmodernism as simply broadening the field in certain ways. So that's one question people often ask. Here's perhaps the most important question that critics ask all the time, and that has to do with postmodernism's revolutionary potential. We've seen that as we enter this period, artists are very, very critical. So you can think of Ralph Ellison and how he portrays this really corrupt structure of authority and battle royal, and certainly Allen Ginsberg and Moloch, right? It's a thorough, withering critique of all authoritative institutions within the society in an effort to look for a new way of being. We see that being important to Anzaldúa, who is looking for voices and perspectives that have for too long been silenced, as Harvey mentions here. This is crucial to her work, and there are many other artists working in the late 20th century who feel very much the same way. Meanwhile, there are critics who worry that, well, you see all of this revolutionary and critical energy, and you see this broader social field in which artists from many, many social groups and perspectives are sharing their views, and more narratives and stories and understandings are available. Some critics say, well, yeah, that's fine, but do any of them have an effect, right? Or is this just, have we entered a realm in which anybody can sort of look at the world any way they want to, but since there are so many perspectives, it's unclear that any of them can achieve the kind of broad influence it would take to really affect the society, social relations, and material conditions. In a sense, this goes back to the critical model we looked at earlier from Ihab Hassan, and he published this account of the difference between modernism and postmodernism back in 1971. At that time, he said that modernists clearly demonstrate a sense of purpose, and we saw many texts in which that was clear. The poets especially were unabashed about how they were seeking what would suffice. We see a mission of critique in Allen Ginsberg, in Howell, but there's so much detail and so much energy that some of that purpose gets diffused perhaps into a kind of play. And you may remember I said that the idea, you begin to get the idea in the postmodern period that maybe play is the most important thing for us to do, since some of these authoritative, rigorous senses of mission and history that we've had in the past as a culture and society haven't worked very well. Maybe we just need to play and see what we can come up with, see if we can do better. And you could also think here of Sherman Alexie in Sister Fire, Brother Smoke. Obviously, he's engaged in some grief and some self-questioning there, but there's so much interest in play and in destabilizing identity and in questioning any sort of authoritative or reflexive account of how grief works, that even this poem that involves mourning is also a very, very playful poem. So that's a difference that we can see to some extent between periods. None of these, of course, are absolute, but there is this difference. Some critics of postmodernism say, well, what if play is just play? What if it doesn't change anything? Perhaps, really, art requires a sense of purpose. Frederick Jameson here has been one of the most influential of these critics. He argues that once the modernist at least had a certain unifying idea about style. They all have this sense of prioritizing aesthetic innovation above all else and honing it, making it very, very sharp. So modernism, one rarely calls it playful because the aesthetic work that went into it is so abundantly clear, even though it's just as imaginative as any kind of literature one could hope to find. Jameson says, well, what if today, now that we have so much fragmentation and so much playfulness, art has lost any edge when it comes to creating meaning? What if it's just imitation and pastiche and combinations that are interesting, fun to look at, the sort of thing where you would go to a museum of global culture and say, ooh, that looks neat, but without changing anyone's understanding at a deep level. You'll remember all the way back to when we talked about local color, and there was a concern that this focus on distinct perspectives could tend to commodify those perspectives. Postmodernist art is very, very different. It's much less concerned with traditional form, or I mean, it just doesn't use traditional forms in the way that local color did. But the concern is back. If you're not aiming to a larger horizon of meaning, the question is, what are you really doing? I'm introducing this argument now because it's going to be very important when we get to Glengarry Glen Ross. But with Anzaldúa, I think there's no question but that even though she engages in all these postmodern playful forms, she is absolutely committed to kind of social transformation. And so I'm offering you this quote from a later piece of Ihab Hassan, who argues that, yes, postmodernists play, they change genres. He also uses the terms parody and pastiche, which are very common in talking about postmodernism. He notes that it even sort of dissolves the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, so hence fictional discourse as opposed to factual discourse, and you get nonfiction novels, and this is absolutely true in the late 20th century and the 21st century. And you might say, well, what happens when you sort of blur the boundary between reality and fiction? And he argues that that can actually be energizing and productive because it involves a different kind of work for the reader, for the audience. Suddenly, we become responsible for creating more of the meaning, interpreting more of the meaning. The author, in the postmodern context, really wants their audience to engage. This is true at a certain level of modernist also. Faulkner doesn't make it easy for you. He wants you to do some work. And many of the poets talked about the importance of, energizing the reader's mind. That was the goal. But postmodernists even often want audiences to get involved as a group, right? It invites performance. It wants to be written, revised, answered, acted out. The transgression of genres is a way of encouraging readers to get together and say, what's going on here? Do I believe this? Do I believe that? Is this the narrator's idiosyncratic perspective, or is this an account of what the real world is like? What do I think? So it's not about creating a narrative for others to enjoy or marvel at, but rather a matter of creating narrative possibilities that audiences and readers can work with in order to develop new senses of meaning.
So let's first take a look at fiction as a genre within Anzaldúa's text. And in this passage, we have an instant where she's narrating this woman who's digging among the roots of the trees, and she's shifting through bones. It almost feels like a myth of this ancient woman trying to find her identity. And then she goes in and describes all the elements that are in her bag that seem to have like a particular relevance for her identity. She pulled bones, bark, hierbas, eagle feathers, snake skin, tape recorder. So these are modern elements, these are mestiza elements, and it strangely it reminds me of Zora Neale Hurston's The Cosmic Bag Maker in a way, and so we can see this as a fictional representation of La Mestiza.
Absolutely, that's so perfect. And I also want to just point to a couple of, like, the Mooney Bart Metro map. She is also a traveler. She's been to San Francisco and ridden that Bay Area rapid transit. She has an eyebrow pencil in there with her herbs and her bark, so it's this wonderful mix of different temporalities and cultural forms, all offering her their goods.
The next genre we'll look at is poetry, which she kind of weaves in and out so frequently in this piece, from little short two-line poems to longer explorations, kind of weaving back and forth even between English and Spanish and variants of those languages within the poems. And in this one she says, because I am mestiza, continually walk out of one culture and into another, right? She's literally crossing boundaries, crossing borders. Because I am in all cultures at the same time. She is the raza mestiza, this cosmic race. Alma entre mundos, tres, cuatro. She's 1, 2, 3 races at the same time. And she's guided by all these different voices that speak to her at the same time. So memoir as a form that exists in this text is important because Anzaldúa is using it to tell us something very intimate about herself, about her experience as a mestiza, and this relates something very intimate to the reader. She says, as a mestiza, I have no country. And this seems like a very sad thing for her to say. My homeland casts me out. Not only does she have a homeland, but she feels alienated from this homeland. Yet all countries are mine because I am every woman's sister or potential lover. And here it kind of takes a positive spin, like this, in this cosmic way. She can find relation to other people, even though she feels alienated with her home country. And as a lesbian, I have no race. My own people disclaim me, but I am all races because there is the queer in me in all races.
And yet, even as she has this global planetary connection, she still has a love of the local place where she came from. And so toward the end of this section, she comes back and she talks about a literal return to the valley. She says, being away for so long has cost me great pain, and she just looks at the landscape. It's a poetic description. She sees a hawk circling over her, checking her out as potential carry-on, like as a meal. And then she sees a little bird behind it. So there's this sense of conflict in the home place, right? There's danger, but there's also new, smaller forms of life doing interesting things. And it's not like some remote place. She makes that point. She can hear the expressway. So it's this place that's connected to the larger world, but it's so important to her personally that she feels this pull in the gut, just being back in the land and the climate, feeling it, despite these planetary connections and all of the vigor that comes with that, the local place still remains important.
And of course, she also conducts a great deal of social analysis and cultural criticism. You see this in several pieces in our excerpt and throughout the book. And I've mentioned that she was an academic later in her career, so this makes sense as one genre. But by combining these genres, she gives readers many different ways in which to enter the text. She not only literally offers different languages with which we can engage with the text, but also offers us the chance to read fiction and myth about a person who's not exactly an individual, not an actual person, but a fictional character. She offers poetry, kind of reflection on a life that could be hers or others, right? Sort of persona poetry. She provides direct memoir, her life, with which we can compare and engage. And then, of course, just this analysis. Note the word we. This is that performative kind of gesture that Hassan notes in so much postmodern literature. We see Anzaldúa 4 ways and probably more, and we can relate with her and position ourselves in relation to her through whatever genre we choose, or perhaps we can shift from one to another. Perhaps we imagine her life as an actual person in some cases, or we see her as part of a group with whom we're interacting at others. It's also important to note what she actually says in this passage, where she says one can't just stand on the riverbank shouting questions and challenging convention. She's especially concerned with, heterosexism, we've seen, but also just sexism and racism. She wants to challenge all of those ideas, but she doesn't want to just do that. She doesn't want to get caught into some kind of duel of oppressor and oppressed. Obviously, challenging sexism and racism are important. It's a step towards liberation from cultural domination, she says. But challenging those bad and oppressive things won't necessarily produce new ways of being in the world. We have to get rid of what is already bad, and then we also have to create something new. And she says it's important that we act and not react, not just assume that we're going to struggle in mortal combat with the way things were. We might decide we want to just start something completely new, or we might do something else. But what is important is that we leave all of these options, investigate them all. So for Anzaldúa, all this creativity is clearly not just play. She is interested in hybridity, as Sarah said earlier, but she also feels that the future depends on that. Old paradigms have to break down, and we have to straddle them, combine them, find new ways to interact with them and new possibilities from their fragments. We have to change the way we perceive reality and ourselves, and that's how we will create a new real. This idea of an inner struggle among psyches that have already been intersected by these borders is crucial to her sense of this new consciousness. She lists all of these different types of people, these different social demographics, and notice how she includes class and combines different versions of class and race. The struggle, she says, has always been inner. We have to transform ourselves, and that's how we transform society. I can't say that it's a completely new idea, that before postmodernism came along, no one ever had this idea. But it is central to postmodern understandings of how social change happens. It begins with a transformation in thought.